Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In today's lecture, we will discuss the internal features of thalamus. You know, thalamus is part of diencephalon. The other important part of the diencephalon is hypothalamus. Now, thalamus is larger in size as compared to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is nearly equal to the weight of nail of your little finger. Now, thalamus is interposed between the cerebral cortex on one side and with the hypothalamus, basal ganglion and cerebellum on the other side. Now, structurally, thalamus is an ovoid mass of gray matter. But inside this gray matter is divided into three parts by internal medullary lamina. Internal medullary lamina is the only white matter embedded in the gray matter of the thalamus. It is a Y-shaped mass of white matter inside the thalamus. Now, what are the surface features? Then subdivisions. And thalamic nuclei. You know, the thalamus is egg-shaped and ovoid mass of gray matter. Now its anterior end is somewhat pointed, while the posterior end is broader as compared to the anterior end. And you know, the posterior end is also known as pelvinar. Now, if you want to study the surface features and also internal features of thalamus, we have to look inside. For that, for example, we give a cut, a vertical section close to the posterior end. At this level, when we cut the thalamus, what will be its internal features? Suppose this is anterior end of the thalamus, which is also known as tubercle. And here the posterior end, which is known as the pelvinar, is cut. vertical section close to the pelvinar is cut to see the interior of the thalamus. Now, what are its surface features? On the superior surface, there is a layer of white matter. Which cover the whole superior surface from posterior end to the anterior end. This layer of white matter which cover the superior surface of the thalamus is known as stratum zonale. This is a layer of white matter covering the superior surface. Of thalamus. Then the lateral surface is also covered by a layer of white matter. Known as the external medullary lamina. It is also white matter over the lateral surface of thalamus. Then medial surface is covered by a layer of simple cuboidal epithelium known as ependyma. Ependyma, that is, it is covering the medial surface of the thalamus and is the ependymal lining of third ventricle. Now, a midline structure through the cerebrum separating the right and left cerebral hemisphere. This is the cut surface of the corpus callosum. This is fornix, lamina terminalis. Then anterior commissure, not lamina terminalis, septum pellucidum. Anterior commissure, this is lamina terminalis, optic chiasma, tuber cinereum, attached to the pituitary gland, mammillary body, and midbrain section. And posteriorly is pineal body attached to the posterior wall of the third ventricle, and then posterior commissure. Now here between right and left diencephalon is the cavity of the third ventricle. So this is lateral wall of the third ventricle, this is hypothalamic sulcus. So above and behind the hypothalamic sulcus is the thalamus. Below and in front is the hypothalamus. So fornix, septum pellucidum, corpus callosum, anterior wall of the third ventricle, posterior wall of the third ventricle, floor of the third ventricle. So this is lateral wall of the third ventricle, which is formed by diencephalon. So above and behind the hypothalamic sulcus is the thalamus. Below and in front is the hypothalamus. So because this is lateral wall of the third ventricle and all the ventricles are lined by ependema, so this will be the medial surface of the thalamus. So medial surface of the thalamus is covered by ependymal lining of the third ventricle. Superior surface is covered by a layer of white matter from posterior to the anterior, and it is known as the stratum zonale. It is white matter. Then the lateral surface is covered again by a layer of white matter, which is known as the external medullary lamina. Now if we draw a coronal section, the right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere, then midbrain. Now cross section of the corpus callosum. And here on each side is diencephalon. Thalamus above on each side and hypothalamus below. This is septum pellucidum, and then fornix. This is cavity of the third ventricle. So you can see the ventricles, the lateral ventricle, and below the third ventricle is lined by ependyma. So this is medial surface of the thalamus. It is covered by ependyma of the third ventricle. Why? Because the thalamus is forming the posterior part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So this is medial surface, and superior surface is stratum zonale. And then on the medial surface, is external medullary lamina. Lateral surface is external medullary lamina. Medial surface ependyma, superior surface stratum zonale, and lateral surface, which is directed towards the white matter of cerebral hemisphere, is the external medullary lamina. And this lateral surface is in relation with the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb of the internal capsule. And you know, here is the lentiform nucleus. Here is caudate nucleus. And here is thalamus. So, lateral surface of the thalamus is covered by a layer of white matter known as the external medullary lamina, as shown in this diagram. Cut surface, external medullary lamina, and it is related to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Then the superior surface of the thalamus is covered again by a white matter known as the stratum zonale. This is white matter called stratum zonale, covering the whole superior surface. Then the medial surface of the thalamus is forming the lateral wall of the posterior part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. And because ventricle is lined by ependyma, therefore the medial surface is covered by simple cuboidal epithelium, that is the ependymal lining of the third ventricle. So these were surface features: stratum zonale, superior surface, external medullary lamina, lateral surface, ependyma, the medial surface. Now, thalamus is divided into three parts with the help of another layer of white matter known as internal medullary lamina. Embedded in the gray matter, again there is a white matter, which is known as the internal medullary lamina. This is internal medullary lamina. Which extends throughout the interior of thalamus. This is known as the internal medullary lamina. Now, if we dissect out the internal medullary lamina and draw a three-dimensional view of the internal medullary lamina, it will then this is internal medullary lamina, a layer of white matter. So it is like this. It comprises of number one, this vertical part. It then split into two laminae which diverge from each other, embedded inside the vertical part, and two diverging laminae extending throughout the interior of the thalamus from its posterior end to the anterior end. Now it is just like this. For example, this is a register, so you can see the upper part splits like this. The lower vertical part and the upper part split and divide into two diverging laminae. This is internal medullary lamina. It is a mass of white matter embedded in the gray matter. Now in this way, the internal medullary lamina divide the thalamus into three parts. So you can see this between the laminae, this is anterior part. Towards the medial side is the medial part. Towards the lateral side is the lateral part. So the internal medullary lamina divide the interior of the gray matter of the thalamus into these three parts. Now the anterior part. This is the anterior part. Now anterior part of the thalamus, gray matter of thalamus, is bounded below by the diverging laminae of the internal medullary lamina, and above is the stratum zonale. So between stratum zonale above and the diverging laminae of the intermedullary lamina is the anterior part. Now here between the vertical part of the internal medullary lamina and the medial surface ependymal lining is the medial part of the thalamus. Then between the vertical part of the internal medullary lamina and the external medullary lamina on the lateral side, this is the lateral part of the thalamus. So the gray matter of the thalamus is divided into anterior part, medial part, and lateral part by the internal medullary lamina. Now what are the different nuclei? Inside the gray matter divided into various thalamic nuclei. We divide them into major nuclei and minor major nuclei and the minor nuclei. Now major nuclei, we draw again horizontal section through the thalamus. Horizontal section through the thalamus, dividing into upper half and lower half to show the interior or inside of the thalamus. And I told you inside is the white mass of gray matter, which is again divided into three parts by internal medullary lamina, a Y-shaped mass of white matter. This is section through internal medullary lamina. Now dividing the thalamus into three parts. Anterior part, medial part, lateral part. Now in each part there are major nuclei. Now in the anterior part there is one nucleus. Suppose this is a section through nucleus. A nucleus embedded in the anterior part of the thalamus. Anterior nucleus. There is only one nucleus in the anterior part, anterior nucleus. Then medial part, again there is one nucleus. Lateral part have several nuclei. In the lateral part, there are several nuclei. Which are classified into ventral tire nuclei and dorsal tire nuclei. So these are major nuclei which are embedded in the gray matter of the thalamus. So the internal medullary lamina, a Y-shaped mass of gray matter. Divide the thalamus into anterior part, medial part, and lateral part. All these parts are occupied by nuclei. In the anterior part, there is one nucleus, known as the anterior nucleus. In the medial part, again, there is only one nucleus called the median nucleus. In the lateral part, there are several nuclei which are classified into two major parts, ventral tire nuclei and dorsal tire nuclei, which we will discuss later on in detail. So these were the major nuclei. Next group of nuclei are the minor nuclei. Minor nuclei are comprised of three groups: paraventricular, nuclei, intralaminar nuclei, and reticular nuclei. Three minor groups of nuclei. Now the intralaminar nuclei. These are nuclei which are embedded in the internal medullary lamina. Nuclei embedded in the internal medullary lamina are known as the intralaminar nuclei. Nuclei embedded in the internal lamina, known as the intralaminar nuclei. Then there are nuclei embedded in the medial wall, ependymal lining. These are the paraventricular nuclei. Paraventricular nuclei, because the medial wall ependymal lining is forming the superior part of the lateral wall with third ventricle. So parallel to the third ventricle, paraventricular nuclei. Then I told you that the lateral surface is covered by external medullary lamina. External medullary lamina. And I told you that it is related to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is anterior limb and this is posterior limb. Posterior limb of internal capsule. Here is the lentiform nucleus. Here is caudate nucleus. So the external medullary lamina, which cover the lateral surface of the thalamus, is related to the posterior limb. Now here between the external medullary lamina and posterior limb of the internal capsule, again there are some group of nuclei. These nuclei are known as the reticular nuclei. So these were the minor nuclei, the paraventricular nuclei, then the intralaminar nuclei embedded in the internal medullary lamina, and reticular nuclei located between the external medullary lamina and posterior limb of the internal capsule in the white matter of cerebral hemisphere. So paraventricular, intralaminar and reticular nuclei are grouped as the minor thalamic nuclei, while the anterior nucleus, medial nucleus, then in the lateral part there are nuclei called ventral tier nuclei and dorsal tier nuclei, which occupy the lateral part. These are major nuclei of the thalamus. Now we talk about the internal medullary lamina. What is the structure of internal medullary lamina? Structure of internal medullary lamina. As I told you that it is a Y-shaped layer of white matter embedded inside the thalamus, and divide the gray matter of the thalamus into anterior part, medial part, lateral part. The lateral part, the medial part, and the anterior part, a Y-shaped mass of white matter. Now, what is the structure of internal medullary lamina? Number one, it comprises of axons of thalamic nuclei and interconnect the thalamic nuclei with one another. Second, in it are embedded intralaminar nuclei. Comprise of nerve fibers or axons of different groups of thalamic nuclei. In this way, interconnect the thalamic nuclei with one another. And second, embedded in the internal medullary lamina are one group of minor nuclei, that is intralaminar nuclei. This is structure of the internal medullary lamina. Now we will discuss the further detailed structure of the gray matter of the thalamus, that is different major nuclei, their connections, their functions, and their locations. Suppose this is horizontal section through the thalamus. Then Y-shaped white matter known as the internal medullary lamina. Internal medullary lamina. Now the internal medullary lamina are divided into anterior part. Three parts, three subdivisions. Anterior part. This is medial part. This whole is lateral part. Three major parts of the thalamus divided by internal medullary lemon. Now in each part there is a nucleus. In the anterior part there is one nucleus, anterior nucleus. In the medial part there is one nucleus called medial nucleus. In the lateral part there are several nuclei. Is ventral anterior nucleus. Ventral anterior nucleus. Ventral lateral nucleus. Then there is a ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Then the ventral posterior medial nucleus. Here is lateral dorsal nucleus. And here is lateral posterior nucleus. Here is pulvinar. And to the inferior surface of pulvinar, you know there is lateral geniculate body. And medial geniculate body. Attached to the inferior surface of the posterior end, that is pulvinar. The lateral and medial geniculate bodies collectively known as metathalamus. This is lateral geniculate body. Lateral geniculate body. And this is a medial geniculate body. Lateral geniculate and medial geniculate body collectively known as the metathalamus. Now on the medial surface, I told you there is ependyma, simple cuboidal epithelium. condymal lining of the third ventricle. And on the lateral surface, told you there is a layer of white matter known as the external medullary lamina. So horizontal section to the thalamus showing the various surface features, internal medullary lamina, three subdivisions occupied by different thalamic nuclei. Now, what are the functions of the thalamus? It is both sensory functions and motor functions. Sensory and motor functions. Now, thalamus is a relay station. As far as the sensory functions are concerned, it is a relay station for all sensations except olfactory sensation. All the sensations coming from the periphery, they are first relayed in the thalamus and then they project into the sensory cortex, with one exception, that is the olfactory sensation. Now, thalamus is not only the relay station, it also integrates crude integration of sensations. Not only receive and then relay the sensation except sense of smell, but also it integrates crudely all the sensations received by the thalamus. Now, these are the lateral nuclei. In the nuclei in the lateral part of the thalamus, which are several in number, we divide them into two groups, that is ventral tire nuclei and dorsal tier nuclei. Ventral and dorsal tier nuclei. Now, the ventral tier nuclei, they are ventral anterior and ventral lateral nuclei. These are motor nuclei. These are the motor nuclei of the thalamus. So, apart from sensory function, the thalamus also then sensory function, as I told you, not only relay the sensations, except sense of smell, but also crudely integrate these sensations received by the thalamus. So these dorsal tier nuclei are the sensory nuclei. Ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial. These are the motor nuclei of the, these are the sensory nuclei of the thalamus. The dorsal tier nuclei comprise of ventral posterior lateral nucleus, ventral posterior medial nucleus. These nuclei are sensory nuclei. Now the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Ventral posterior medial nucleus. Sensory nuclei. Now ventral posterior lateral nucleus. One of the dorsal tier nuclei, ventral posterior lateral nucleus. And then ventral posterior medial nucleus, another group of dorsal tier nuclei. Ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Sensory nuclei, they carry sensations. They are connected to sensory cortex. Projected to the sensory cortex of cerebral hemisphere. Now a little further detail about these two groups. The dorsal tier nuclei, two groups of nuclei. Now sensations. Now Which sensation? General sensations. General sensations, that is touch, pain, thermal temperature, and proprioception, sensation from the joints. General sensations. From body except head region. All these general sensations, that is the touch, pain, temperature sensation, proprioceptive sensations from all parts of the except head region, they are carried to the thalamus. Suppose this is thalamus. And which nucleus? Ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus of thalamus. Ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus of thalamus. So sensations are carried to the thalamus, where they are relayed and they are integrated crudely via tracts. What are the tracts? Spinothalamic, tracts, and number 2, bulbothalamic, tracts. The sensations they are carried to the thalamus via tracts. Spinothalamic tracts from spinal cord to the thalamus. Bulbothalamic tract, the other name for the medulla oblongata is bulb. So from the medulla to the thalamus. Now which nucleus of the thalamus? Ventral, posterior, lateral thalamus carry all sensations, general sensations from all parts of the body except head region via spinothalamic and bulbothalamic tracts. These are relayed in the ventral, posterolateral nucleus, and from this nucleus these impulses pass to the opposite cerebral hemisphere, the cerebral cortex of opposite cerebral hemisphere. This is suppose cerebral cortex. Right and left cerebral hemisphere. From the ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus, these sensations are carried to the cerebral cortex. They project to the sensory cortex of opposite cerebral hemisphere. Again via tracts, that is thalamocortical tract. The nerve fibers arise from the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus, and they relay in the opposite sensory cortex, carrying general sensation from the whole body except the head region. Via bulbothalamic and spinothalamic tract, relay in the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus, and then ultimately project to the sensory cortex. Then regarding ventral posterior medial nucleus. Ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus. Again, sensations, general sensations. Touch, pain, temperature, etc. General sensations. From head region of the body. For the whole body except the head region, the sensations are relayed in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Now what about the head region? The general sensation from the head region, they are carried again to the thalamus. Which nucleus? Ventral posterior medial nucleus. Of thalamus. From the head region, the impulses pass to the thalamus via trigeminal tract. You know, senses supply to the greater part of the head is via trigeminal tract. From the head region, the tract arises in the form of trigeminal tract, which relay in the ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus, and from the thalamus these impulses again pass to the cerebral cortex, opposite cerebral cortex of opposite cerebral hemisphere. Sensory cortex. So this was detail about the motor nuclei, ventral anterior nucleus and ventral lateral nucleus of the thalamus in the lateral part of the thalamus, and these are classified as ventral tire nuclei. We concerned with the motor activity. Then next is the dorsal tire nuclei, which are sensory in function, that is ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial nuclei. They carry general sensation. Ventral posterior lateral nucleus carries sensation from the whole body except head region to the sensory cortex, while the ventral posterior medial nucleus carries sensation from the head region again to the sensory cortex. Next is the anterior nucleus, which occupy the anterior part. What are its connections? That is limbic lobe and medullary body. Anterior part occupied by the anterior nucleus. It is connected with the limbic lobe and with the medullary body. From the medullary body, the fiber pass to enter the anterior nucleus through mammillothalamic tract. And what are the functions of this? Nucleus functions. Functions, that is learning, then integration, memory, then emotions. These are important functions of the anterior nucleus. Then medial nucleus. It is connected to other thalamic nuclei. Also connected to the prefrontal cortex of cerebral hemisphere. You know, the important function of the prefrontal cortex is personality and emotions. These are the connections and functions of the medial nucleus, which is in the medial part. Next is the pulvinar. The posterior end of the thalamus, pulvinar. Now, what are its connections? It is connected to the other thalamic nuclei. It is connected to the metathalamus. That is lateral and medial geniculate bodies. Metathalamus connected to the visual cortex and connected to the auditory cortex. These are the connections of the pulvinar. Then I told you on the inferior surface of the pulvinar is metathalamus, comprised of two bodies, lateral geniculate body and medial geniculate bodies. The lateral geniculate body is a relay station in visual pathway. Visual pathway and medial geniculate body is a relay station in auditory pathway. Medial geniculate body relations, it is a relay station in auditory pathway, that is hearing, pathway for the hearing. Now, the key for this diagram you should know, because we used abbreviations. So AN nuclei. And then another group is the reticular nuclei. They are located close to the external medullary lamina, between external medullary lamina and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. These are reticular nuclei. So this diagram shows both major nuclei and the minor nuclei in the form of paraventricular nuclei, in the form of intralaminar nuclei, and in the form of reticular nuclei. These minor nuclei form the minor thalamic nuclei. Form the thalamic reticular system. Minor thalamic collectively form the thalamic reticular system. So this was all about the external, internal features, the various nuclei, their functions and connection regarding thalamus. Thank you very much.